The Smithsonian Institution was founded in 1846 with money left by a British scientist named James Smithson, who had never visited the United States, and whose reasons for leaving his considerable estate to a country he had never seen remained genuinely unclear. He specified only that the money should be used for the increase and diffusion of knowledge, a mandate broad enough to mean almost anything, and specific enough to mean that whatever the institution became, it would be in the business of deciding which knowledge counted. That decision, which knowledge counts, how it is categorized, who gets to announce findings, and in what language, what happens to findings that don't fit, has followed the Smithsonian through all of its nearly 2 centuries, and it follows this account too. Because what the Smithsonian was doing in the 1880s was, among other things, building the frameworks that American science would use to understand its own continent's human past. And those frameworks have proven more durable and more consequential than most people realize. The decade of the 1880s was the Smithsonian's most aggressive period of collection. The Bureau of American Ethnology, established in 1879 under the direction of John Wesley Powell, was sending teams across the continent with the explicit mandate to document, collect, and return to Washington whatever the continent's soil contained that bore on the question of American prehistory. Powell himself was a remarkable man. He had lost his right arm at Shiloh, led the first documented passage through the Grand Canyon in 1869, and built the Bureau into an instrument of genuine scientific ambition. He was also a man of his period, which meant he operated within a theoretical framework that divided human cultures into stages of development: savagery, barbarism, civilization, and that used this framework to organize what the Bureau collected and what conclusions it drew. Things that fit the framework were documented and integrated. Things that did not fit the framework presented a different kind of problem. What follows are 5 of those problems, recovered from the Bureau's own archives, from the field journals of its collectors, from the correspondence of its administrators, and from the gaps in its public record where documents should exist and do not. The first concerns the Etowah Mounds in northwestern Georgia, near the present-day town of Cartersville, which the Bureau began systematically excavating in the early 1880s under the direction of Cyrus Thomas, who led the Bureau's division of mound exploration. Thomas was charged with settling what had become, in American archaeology, a genuinely controversial question: who had built the thousands of earthen mounds that dotted the landscape of the American interior, from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes. A popular answer, promoted by various writers and theorists throughout the 19th century, held that the mounds were built by a vanished race of superior beings, the mound builders, who had preceded Native Americans in the continent and been destroyed or displaced by them. This theory was convenient for several reasons that had nothing to do with archaeology and everything to do with the dispossession of living indigenous people from land that contained spectacular prehistoric monuments. But it had adherents with genuine credentials, as well as adherents without any. Thomas's work at Etowah and elsewhere was ultimately directed at refuting the mound builder myth, and in this it succeeded. The scientific consensus established through his investigations was that the mounds had been built by the ancestors of present Native American peoples, not by a separate and vanished race. This was accurate, important, and represented a genuine corrective to bad science in service of bad politics. What is less often discussed is what happened to a specific assemblage of artifacts recovered from the deeper levels of the Etowah site in 1883. Artifacts that a field worker named Harrison Whitman described in his working notes as unlike anything in the mound assemblages above them, in terms of both material and craft. Whitman's notes describe metal objects, some of them in alloys he could not identify by appearance or by his limited ability to test composition in the field, in forms that did not correspond to the ceremonial and decorative metalwork the Etowah excavations were producing in abundance elsewhere. His notes contain a detailed description and then a notation in a different pen that reads, "Return to Thomas," See correspondence. The correspondence file for Whitman's 1883 season in the Bureau's archive is missing. The artifacts themselves are not in the Smithsonian's collections under any cataloging system that has been made publicly accessible. Whitman appears in Bureau employment records through 1884, and then does not appear again. The second concerns a man named George Hoffman, a field collector working in the Ohio Valley, who submitted a report to the Bureau in June of 1881 describing the opening of a burial mound near Chillicothe, Ohio, a site of considerable Hopewell cultural significance, in which, at the lowest level of the excavation, the team encountered a layer of material that Hoffman described as a form of poured or cast stone, exhibiting regular surface patterning inconsistent with natural formation. He submitted samples to Washington. The accompanying letter requested a prompt response as to the nature of the material, because he was not certain how to proceed with the excavation and did not want to disturb the layer without guidance. The Bureau's incoming correspondence register for July 1881 shows receipt of a package from Hoffman in Chillicothe. There is no outgoing response in the register for the following 2 months. Hoffman's next submission to the Bureau, from September of the same year, concerns an entirely different site and makes no mention of the Chillicothe material or the unanswered request for guidance. The samples he submitted are not in the Smithsonian's geological or archaeological collections under his name or under the site designation used in his report. The mound itself was subsequently incorporated into a private farm, and no further excavation has been conducted. The third involves the most senior figure in this account, and therefore the most delicate to discuss. Powell himself, in the private correspondence he maintained with the geologist Grove Carl Gilbert throughout the early 1880s, made reference on 3 occasions to what he called the consistency problem, a phrase he did not define, but used in a way that suggests it was an established subject between the 2 men, not a concept being introduced. The letters are in the Library of Congress, where Powell's papers are archived, and the Gilbert letters are in the American Philosophical Society's collection. Read together. The relevant passages suggest that Powell and Gilbert were discussing a pattern they had identified in the Bureau's incoming field reports, a recurring category of finding that did not fit the developmental schema the Bureau was using to organize American prehistory, and that appeared with a frequency sufficient to constitute a pattern rather than an anomaly. Gilbert's responses to Powell on this subject are notable for the caution they exhibit, which is more than Powell's letters show. Gilbert was a senior figure at the U.S. Geological Survey and acutely sensitive to the institutional politics of publicly contradicting the frameworks that had organized American science for a generation. In one letter, Gilbert wrote to Powell that he had reviewed the materials Powell had forwarded and found them, as Powell had suggested, difficult to situate within the existing account, and that he was inclined to think the difficulty was in the account rather than in the materials, but that saying so publicly would require more accumulation of similar material than either of them currently had access to, and that in the meantime a degree of patience was advisable. The word patience, in this context, was doing considerable work. Powell's third letter on the subject, dated March of 1883, ends with a sentence that has attracted the attention of at least 2 historians who have written about the Bureau's early years, neither of whom has found a satisfactory interpretation of it. He wrote, "The consistency of the inconsistency is itself the finding, and I am not certain we are in a position to say so." He did not say so. The Bureau's published findings from the 1880s present a coherent and internally consistent picture of American prehistory, organized along the developmental stages Powell had been trained to apply. The inconsistency that Powell found consistent enough to name in private correspondence to his closest scientific colleague is not visible in the public record. Whether this represents active suppression Institutional inertia, the ordinary tendency of scientific paradigms to absorb anomalies by minimizing them, or something else entirely, is a question the available evidence does not definitively answer. What the letters do establish, beyond reasonable ambiguity, is that the man running the Bureau was privately aware that his institution's public account was incomplete, not because the field was still developing, which it was, but because specific categories of finding were not being integrated into the account at all. Powell knew the categories were being strained. He told Gilbert this. He did not tell anyone else, at least not in any document that has survived in accessible form, and the Bureau continued producing its published reports as though the consistency problem did not exist. The fourth item in this account surfaced in 2019, which is recent enough that its full implications have not yet been absorbed by the researchers who have encountered it. A graduate student in the history of science at a Midwestern university, working through a collection of uncatalogued materials in a regional archive in Indiana, found a folder of documents that had been misfiled under an administrative designation for the Bureau's correspondence with state geological surveys, a category that researchers working on the Bureau's field activities rarely had reason to examine. The folder contained, among other things, a hand-drawn map, 3 pages of descriptive notes, and a series of detailed sketches on drafting paper. The map showed a location in southern Indiana, near the confluence of 2 small tributaries of the East Fork of the White River, with measurements indicating a subsurface feature at a depth of approximately 18 feet beneath the surface of a low ridge above the floodplain. The descriptive notes, in a hand that does not correspond to any Bureau collector identified in the Bureau's own personnel records, described an excavation conducted in the summer of 1880 and the discovery at depth of a structure. The word used is structure, underlined, with a notation beside it that reads, "Not burial, not mound, not consistent with known Indian work." The sketches show what appears to be a rectilinear arrangement of fitted stone elements, drawn with the kind of careful dimension drafting that suggests the person who made them had some technical training. Several of the stones in the sketch are noted with symbols that the descriptive notes key to a brief legend. One symbol indicates cut surfaces. One indicates what the note describes as machine smoothness, and one, used on the largest stones at what appears to be the base of the arrangement, is described in the legend only as marks not identified. The graduate student, whose name I am withholding at her request because she is still working on the material and is concerned about the professional consequences of public association with a finding that has not yet been through peer review, shared copies of the documents with 3 other researchers before bringing them to the attention of her dissertation committee. Of the 3 researchers, one, a historian of science with no archaeological training, reviewed the documents and found them consistent in paper, ink, and handwriting style with Bureau-era materials. One, an archaeologist working in the Eastern Woodlands tradition, reviewed them and declined to comment. And one, a retired archivist from the Smithsonian's own National Anthropological Archives, reviewed them and said that the administrative filing designation under which they had been found was used by the Bureau in the 1880s for materials that had been pulled from the active files for review by Powell's office and not returned to the active files. This designation, the archivist explained, was in practice a form of administrative quarantine, a way of removing materials from the working record without formally destroying them or creating a record of their removal. The location identified in the map has not been excavated. It is privately owned agricultural land. The landowner has not been approached because the researchers involved have not yet determined how to approach a landowner with a request to excavate based on a century and 40-year-old misfiled document from a government archive without triggering the precise kind of public attention they are not ready to invite. The 5th item requires more care than the others. because it involves human remains, and because the current legal and ethical framework around the treatment of indigenous human remains is different from the framework that governed the Bureau's practices in the 1880s, and both of these things are relevant to the account. The Bureau's collectors in this period were, in significant numbers of cases, acquiring skeletal material from burial sites, legally under the law of the period, which provided no protection for ancient burials, and with the support of an academic culture that actively wanted such collections for the purposes of the physical anthropology of the day. This collection practice has since been addressed legislatively. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990 required federally funded institutions to inventory and repatriate indigenous human remains and associated burial objects. The Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History, which held the largest such collection in the country, has been engaged in repatriation under NAGPRA and its own earlier legislation for more than 3 decades. What the repatriation process revealed, in addition to the scale of the collection itself, was the existence of a significant number of specimens in the collection that could not be straightforwardly attributed to any known indigenous cultural group under any of the conventional classification systems. These specimens were identified in a series of internal review documents produced by the Museum of Natural History between 1994 and 2003. Documents that were generated as part of the repatriation compliance process and that are technically public records, but that have not been widely discussed outside the narrow institutional context in which they were produced. The review documents describe the unattributed specimens in language that is careful and bureaucratic, and occasionally, between the lines visibly strained. Phrases like exhibiting morphological characteristics not consistent with regional archaeological populations and presenting metric dimensions outside the range documented for associated assemblages appear in cluster in sections dealing with material recovered from sites in the Ohio Valley, the Mid-Mississippi region, and the Great Lakes drainage. The metric dimensions in question were not elaborated on in the review documents with any precision, because the documents were written for a compliance process, not a research one. And the compliance process required only that specimens be characterized sufficiently to determine whether they could be attributed to a present-day group for repatriation purposes. What the documents do note, in a section dealing with procedural guidance for collection staff, is that specimens whose morphological and metric characteristics fell outside the documented range for associated assemblages should be referred for specialist review before any repatriation determination was made. The specialist review process is mentioned in the procedural guidance as a resource. It is not mentioned again in the body of the review documents, and the specimens described as requiring it are tracked in a separate internal register that has not been made publicly accessible as part of the repatriation process's documentation. The specimens in question were recovered predominantly in the 1880s and 1890s. Most of them have not been repatriated because the repatriation process requires attribution to a specific present-day group or groups. And attribution requires the morphological and metric characteristics of the specimens to correspond to known populations. When they do not correspond, the process stalls. What connects these 5 items is not a single theory, and it would be intellectually dishonest to press them into the service of one. They are not all the same kind of thing. Whitman's missing artifact assemblage from Etowah is a disappearance in the physical record. Hoffman's unanswered correspondence is an institutional silence. Powell's private letters are the candid acknowledgement by the person most responsible for the public record that the public record was incomplete. The misfiled Indiana documents are a suppression mechanism made visible by a filing error across a century and a half. The repatriation review documents are the formal record of a category of physical evidence that the existing frameworks cannot accommodate, and that therefore cannot move through the institutional processes designed for accommodating things. What they share is the structure of a gap. a place where the record has something missing from it, and where the shape of the missing thing can be inferred from the edges of what surrounds it. Science advances through anomalies, which is Thomas Kuhn's insight and one of the more durable ideas of 20th century philosophy of science. Normal science generates the anomalies that eventually force paradigm shifts. And paradigm shifts are preceded by periods of anomaly accumulation during which the existing framework absorbs as many inconsistencies as it can before the weight becomes unsupportable. The Bureau of American Ethnology in the 1880s was not uniquely corrupt or uniquely incurious. It was an institution doing what institutions do, which is organize the world according to the categories available to it. And when the world declined to fit those categories, finding ways to accommodate the decline that did not require revising the categories. Powell knew the categories were being strained. He said so to Gilbert in private and said nothing to anyone in public. The fourth item, the misfiled Indiana documents, with their sketches of stone arrangements that were not Indian work and their legend of marks not identified, is the most recently surfaced of these five. And it is the most unsettled, because it exists in the hands of researchers who are still deciding what to do with it, in a professional climate that rewards caution and punishes the kind of claim that cannot be immediately supported by the kind of evidence that the existing framework recognizes as evidence. This is the consistency problem Powell named in 1883 and did not publish. It is still the consistency problem. The inconsistencies are consistent. The gaps have the same shape. The marks have not been identified, and the people best positioned to identify them are still deciding whether it is safe to try.